Reverend Kirsten Fryer from Bethlehem Lutheran in the Midway in St. Paul. And members, as usual, following the prayer, please remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Good morning, Senators. My 7-year-old asked me over the weekend, Mom, what's the coldest it's ever been in Minnesota? So we Googled it, and we discovered that on February 2nd, 1996, record-breaking temperature day today, Tower, Minnesota, where's our senator? Is he here? Oh, is he here? Tower, yay! Negative 60 degrees on February 2nd, 1996. So happy record-breaking temperature day. Remembering that, as we pray today, I, for one, am giving thanks for this morning's whopping 11 degrees. So let us pray. For ice-covered lakes, for snow that sparkles in bright winter sun, for all of winter's beauty across this beautiful state, in all of its seasons, and for all of our people, we give you thanks, O God. Especially we pray today for those gathered in this chamber, and for this minute, in the midst of the business and the busyness, we pause. We pause to give thanks for the warmth in this chamber and in those meeting rooms where we find ourselves today, even the drafty ones, for the warmth we feel when stories are shared and ears are open to listen. We pause to remember the ones who work out in the cold today and those who have no place to be warm. As fields across this great state lie dormant, we pause and we pray that we can and we will keep growing in knowledge and compassion. And as we pause, let your warmth fill us with determination and courage and wisdom for this day and for the days ahead. Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Members, as usual, thank you for standing for prayer and for the Pledge of Allegiance. The Secretary will take the roll.
Abler, Anderson, Barr, Bolden, Carlson, Champion, Coleman, Swadzinski, Dames, Dibble, Dornick, Draheim, Drazkowski, Duckworth, Diedzik, Eichhorn, Farnsworth, Fateh, Friends, Green, Grunhagen, Gustafson, Hochschild, Herr, Hoffman, Housley, Howe, Jasinski, Johnson, Klein, Karan, Kroon, Kanesh, Kapek, Lang, Latz, Liskey, Limmer, Lucero, Mann, Marty, Matthews, May Quaid, McEwen, Miller, Mitchell, Mohammed, Morrison, Murphy, Nelson, Umuver-Baton, Pappas, Pa, Port, Pratt, Putnam, Rarick, Rasmussen, Rest, Seeberger, Utke, Weber, Wiesenberg, Westland, Westrom, Wickland, Zhang.
Members, a quorum is present. Members, we are starting with the Senate agenda. Today's Thursday, February 2nd, 2023. We're going to start at the fifth order of business, reports of committees. Senator Diedzik for a motion to adopt the committee reports.
Mr. President, I move the committee reports printed in the agenda be adopted, with the exception of the report pertaining to the appointments, and I ask for a roll call vote.
A roll call vote has been requested, and a roll call vote has been granted. Any discussion? Seeing none, the Secretary will take the roll on the motion to adopt committee reports. Members, as a gentle reminder, please vote. We're voting, and we're supposed to be at our desk voting, please. All those having voted that desire to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There have been 42 ayes and 18 noes. The motion to adopt prevails. Senator Disick.
Mr. President, I move that the committee report pertaining to the appointment be laid on the table, and I ask for a roll call vote.
A roll call vote has been requested, and a roll call vote has been granted. Any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, the secretary will take the roll on the motion to lay appointments on the table. Remember, members, to vote. All those having voted that desire to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There have been 48 ayes and 12 noes. The motion prevails. Members, we will now go to the sixth order of business, second reading of Senate bills. The secretary will read the Senate file numbers.
Senate file numbers 538 and 783.
The Senate files have been given their second reading. Members, we are now going to the bills listed on today's introduction calendar, which are given their first reading and referred as indicated with the following changes. And if you would like to follow along with the changes, please look at your Senate bill introductions document. The following changes are, if you look at page number 6, specifically Senate file number 1136 has been referred to the Committee on Agriculture, Broadband, and Rural Development. Members, please go to page number 10. Specifically, Senate file number 1176 has been referred to the Committee on Health and Human Services. Last but not least, members, please go to page number 13. Senate file number 1201, that's been referred to the Committee on Human Services. As I mentioned, the bills listed today on the introduction calendar are given their first reading and referred as indicated. Members, we are now on the ninth order of business, motions and resolutions. We will adopt the author's motions as one motion. All in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails. I am now calling on Senator Port.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that Senate File 73 be withdrawn from the Committee on State and Local Government and Veterans and re-referred to the Committee on Agriculture, Broadband, and Rural Development.
And Senator Port, is this your bill, and have you talked to both chairs?
It is my bill. I have talked to both chairs. And Mr. President, if I can just make clear to members that we are not skipping state and local gov. We are simply moving it to a different date and keeping this bill on its path. And on a bill of this size, if members can bring me good faith amendments that they want included prior to committees, that is very helpful with us keeping this on track.
Senator Port moved that Senate file number 73 be withdrawn from the Committee on State and Local Governments and Veterans and re-referred to the Committee on Agricultural, Broadband, and Rural Development. On that motion, all those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails. Senator Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that Senate File 225 be withdrawn from the Committee on Labor and be referred to the Committee on Judiciary and Public Safety.
Senator Hoffman, as I often question members, have you, is this your bill, first of all, and have you talked to both chairs?
Yes, yes, and yes. Thank you, Mr. President.
Any discussion? Senator Hoffman moved that Senate file number 225 be withdrawn from the Committee on Labor and re-referred to the Committee on Judiciary and Public Safety. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails. Remaining under the order of business of motion and resolutions, I'll call on Senator Dzik to designate special orders.
Mr. President, pursuant to Rule 26, I designate the following bill be made special orders for immediate consideration. Members, the list is on your desk, and we are hearing Senate File 4, House File 7, the Electric Utility Renewable Energy Standard Obligation Modifications.
The next bill under consideration is number House File 7 on the general orders calendar. Senator Friends.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the amendment made to House File 7 by the Committee on Rules and Administration in the report that we adopted February 1st, 2023, pursuant to Rule 45, be stricken. Thank you.
All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails. Senator Friends.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you, members. This is House File 7, the 100% clean energy by 2040 bill. This is what the people want. This bill will help us reduce carbon emissions. Carbon emissions are the #1 threat to our planet, and they've been rising. This bill will reduce utility carbon emissions between now and 2040 and beyond. This will help the way we work, live, and play. Members, climate change is coming and has been here, and it affects everything we do. In the southwestern part of the state, where Senator Dames, Senator Weber, and I are proud to represent thousands of family farms, drought has now affected us twice in a row. That drought costs money and is a threat to our $20 billion a year agriculture industry. In the southwestern United States, the drought has affected the supply of water so badly that they can now not agree on how to make significant cuts. The climate storm damage in this nation in 2021 totaled $484 billion. That's just the part paid by American insurance companies, which, as we all know, comes from the premiums that each and every American pays. To the bill, Mr. President. Section by section. Section 4, recovery facility as a renewable technology. Section 5, an additional renewable energy standard by 2035. Members, that's 55%. What the bill does is describe a modification or delay of standard. Folks, this is what we're calling the off-ramp. A utility must reach 100% carbon neutral energy by 2040. But if that utilities board wishes to demonstrate or argue that they cannot, for reliability or affordability standards, there is an off-ramp described in Section 6 that allows them to go to the Public Utilities Commission, investor-owned utilities, co-ops, munis. Section 7, partial compliance with the carbon-free standard. We'll talk about this more in a minute. But a utility can get partial credit for technologies that allow them to clean part of the energy. This is especially relevant because the bill is agnostic to the technologies employed. It does not choose winners and losers between the carbon-free technologies. Section 10 is the heart of the bill. It establishes a carbon-free standard, 2030, 2040, 100%. Section 12, use of credits. There was some question whether renewable energy credits would allow a utility, large or small, to meet the standard by the purchase of renewable energy credits. It does. Section 23, exemption from certificate of need. The bill creates an expediting regulatory process in certain projects to make it easier for projects to be built. We have energy generation. We need to get that energy to our Minnesota users. There are 2 prevailing wage requirements that help our working men and women. In a minute, you'll hear about the support from labor. Prevailing wage means local jobs to build and maintain these energy facilities. These are the main provisions of the bill. Members, what you probably can see in front of you is a list of the groups that are in support of House File 7. It is in the dozens. I won't read that list to you, but if you take a look, you will see groups that care about Minnesota's future, about our environment, labor groups including the carpenters, LIUNA, the building trades, working men and women. The utilities were told at the start of this process that they will be allowed to engage beginning, middle, and end, and they have been. In the Energy Committee, we heard testimony from over 24 stakeholders, and many of them were on the phone with us as recently as this morning talking about the bill. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. I'd like to yield, Mr. President, to Senator Mitchell and Senator Kupek for a discussion on climate change. Thank you, Mr. President.
All right, and I do have an order. Senator Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am a meteorologist. I have worked in weather for over 30 years through the military as a forecaster and an observer, often for aviation. 16 years with the hurricane hunters, flying into some of the most extreme weather in the world, including Hurricane Katrina, collecting data from inside storms that goes into the modeling. And I am currently a commander in the National Guard overseeing weather operations. On the civilian side, I have worked at local, state, and national levels, presenting weather and also educating on climate and the environment. During just my 30 years of work, I have personally, as many Minnesotans have seen, the climate change. Going from a childhood where we had cold and snow every winter, to seeing that happen less frequently, to seeing hotter summers. Now, climate in general has always varied. We have records that we're able to trace back literally millions of years, showing some of those variances over time. But it is clear that since the industrial age and human intervention, that humans are changing our climate. And just to give a few examples, and doing it at a more accelerated rate. So for example, just here in Minnesota, there is something called a mega rain event. It has to impact over 1,000 square miles. From the beginning of Minnesota in 1858, so through the 1800s, 1900s, we had 6 of those events in about 150 years. In the last just over 20 years, since 2000, we've had 7 events. The reason some of these events are accelerating is because as the atmosphere warms, it can hold more moisture, and that means when we get these big events, it dumps more on our land. The hot weather also means the contrary. Just in June of 2021, for example, we had the most 90s ever recorded, even before summer technically began. What that did was it kicked off an extreme drought in Minnesota. It dried out our vegetation, and we had a drought for the rest of the summer that impacted farmers. It impacted our vegetation, so we had forest fires on a record level. That forest fire activity led to, in 20 years of records, 3 consecutive records being set for the worst air quality in Minnesota ever. So a lot of these things are tied together. The winter before last, we had never had a tornado past mid-November. We had not just our first December tornado ever, but we had an outbreak. So just to talk about the cost of trying to fix climate change, I would like people to think about that in terms of we already have a cost, and so now is the time to fix that and get ahead of it instead of playing catch up and paying later. So in 2018 for the United States, $306 billion spent on weather-related disasters, including $2.4 in Minnesota billion, just because of a severe hailstorm and high winds. Our 2012 drought was part of a larger drought in the Midwest that cost $34 billion and left 126 people dead. I talked about more events of extreme flooding, more heat waves and higher frequency. So there is a very real financial cost we are already paying for climate change. I would also like to talk about the human cost. I mentioned tornado for the first time ever in December. Our severe weather systems or seasons are getting longer. That's more houses destroyed, more people killed, more lives disrupted. The air quality. Again, that's more people, especially our elderly and our young, who are having respiratory issues. And just at a basic level, I'm a mom, and I want my children to be able to grow up in the same Minnesota I did. Because fixing some of these same problems means our air stays clean, our water stays clean, and we can leave that legacy to the next generation. So there is no time left to act on this. We need to act on this now, and I stand in support of this bill.
Senator Kupik.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Mitchell. Thank you, Senator Frentz. It is not lost on me also that the first day that I am speaking on the Senate floor is Groundhog Day, which is a meteorologist's least favorite holiday. But at least I am here to talk about something very important. So over the last 9 years, they are the warmest 9 years on record globally. 7 of the last 10 years have been the warmest years in Minnesota on record. And so these heat waves are the #1 killer of people. We hear disasters all the time. We think about hurricanes, tornadoes. It's actually heat waves cause the most deaths in this country of any weather phenomenon. And heat waves do not only affect people, they affect animals, and that means that it affects our agriculture industry. So animal health growth, reproduction, they're highly sensitive to temperature changes. Higher summer temperatures, they lead to increased deaths and heat stress, lower production of milk and dairy, cattle and eggs from poultry, slower weight gains, corresponding longer time to market and decreased reproduction so that it can result in smaller herds. Heat stress, hogs eat less when it's hot. According to the USDA, higher summer heat costs in the American swine industry are more than $300 million annually. Heat stress is also on our crops. In western Minnesota, where I am from, we actually on average have 0 100-degree days. We get a couple every few years, but if you average it out, it rounds down to 0. Climate models would predict that by the end of this century, we would see 18 events a year over 100 degrees in western Minnesota. That's right up from the southwest all the way up through the Red River Valley. That would put enormous stress on our crops. So climate, our greatest warming, though, is actually coming in the winter, which as a Minnesotan you might say, that's not a bad thing given the weather we have had certainly this week. Minus 30 is this magical thing in Minnesota. It is one of actually my absolute favorite temperatures. Things get strange outside at minus 30. The sounds carry differently. You can throw that boiling water into the air at minus 30 is a spectacular thing. But you might think maybe minus 30 is not such a good thing. But minus 30, I like to say, keeps out the riffraff in Minnesota. When I'm talking about the riffraff, is I'm talking about invasive species, those things that affect our crops, those things that go after our trees, those things in the water. That minus 30 is critical to keeping that out. So in my area, so Fargo-Moorhead is where I live. Fargo is our record keeper from Moorhead. Since 2000, we have had 7 minus 30 events over the last 20 years. We used to have much more. At times, let's go back to the 70s, we had 14 alone in that decade. So those minus 30 events are going away. So we really need those. That's important. So our biggest climate change that we're seeing, while we've talked a lot about heat, it's really in the wintertime. Northern Minnesota, far northern Minnesota, on average now is 7.3 degrees warmer than it had been in the past. So that is where in our state right now we're seeing the biggest climate change. And that leads also to a decline in ice. So those ice fishing industries, our tourism industries in the winter, going out and snowmobiling, we're seeing those seasons get shorter here. On average, we've lost 10 to 14 days of ice out on our lakes. That will impact eventually our tourism industry if this continues to keep on. Senator Mitchell talked about those heavy rain events. Those heavy rain events, that's also really hard for agriculture to deal with. The climate models, which predicted this 20 years ago, talked about how we would have these heavy rain events followed by periods of extreme dry. Think about just the last few years, and that is the type of weather pattern we have led to. So we'll get that rain, but it comes all too much all at once, and that's not good for farmers' runouts. Today, there are more than 155,000 residential properties, 29,000 miles of roads, 13,000 commercial buildings, and 515 critical infrastructure facilities in Minnesota that are at risk from severe flooding from these events. And according to the Insurance Federation of Minnesota, extreme weather events have caused insurance premiums to increase by 366% since 1998. So that is yet another cost that we are paying. But I will tell you, also coming from Western Minnesota and the city of Moorhead, this is doable. City of Moorhead, the public utility in Moorhead, is already 100% green. All renewable energy. City of Detroit Lakes is 80%. So it is there, it can be done, and I support Senator Friend's bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Friends. After Senator Friends, Senator Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, members. We've had some discussions in this chamber about bipartisanship, about working together. And first of all, I want to thank my co-authors on the bill and the members of the Senate Energy Committee. We had a healthy discussion when this bill came through, and we took amendments and just considered them and gave our best response. This bill represents compromise, Mr. President, on several fronts, and that's a credit to not only the Republican members on the committee and in the caucus, but to those stakeholders who said, hey, we've got to do this differently. Those compromises, Mr. President, that are in the current language of the bill include a compromise on large hydroelectric power, a compromise and clarity on the use of peaking power plants, clarity that utilities, large and small, can buy renewable energy credits. That's a key feature that allows flexibility for these boards. Compromise on partial credit. That's the ability to say, here's the percentage of the clean energy that you can use, and it can be counted. Earlier versions of this bill, and this is the third biennium I've introduced this bill, would not have counted that. Compromise on the use of the renewable energy credits and the standard to satisfy multiple standards. And the big one, Mr. President, was that in the last 14 days, the bill was amended to allow for municipals and co-ops to change the standard as proposed for 2030 from 80% carbon-free energy to 60%. That caused several of our utilities to become more comfortable with the bill, and we've included testimony from those committees. There are other issues, Mr. President, that I want to talk about. I'm guessing with the amendments we'll have a chance to, but here are three things, members, that I think we should not do today. We should not weaken the standard that's in this bill by the date or by percentage. Let's make 100% by 24. It is widely supported. Let's keep that standard. 2, let's not give preference to one type of energy over another. We are talking about carbon-free energy. One thing that utilities have told us is that they would like to have the flexibility to choose their own mix. Amendments that suggest that we change that standard or give one preference to one type of carbon-free energy over another do not fit the stakeholder agreement. And 3, the off-ramp. This off-ramp is meant to protect utilities large and small that simply cannot make it to 100% and are able to demonstrate that. Amendments that change the off-ramp, that widen the off-ramp, that alter the off-ramp will not be accepted by the vast majority of stakeholders and cannot be considered a friendly amendment. Members, we've talked about price and affordability, and this bill offers us both of those. On price, we know that unsubsidized wind power is the cheapest form of energy generation. In my district, in Senator Dames's district, in Senator Weber's district, is some of the best wind turbine conditions in the country. And we are developing that wind power because it is the cheapest. This bill can help drive the energy to the cheapest form and will incentivize these boards to do so. Finally, Mr. President, I'd like to just say a little bit about the boards that will be making these decisions. Investor-owned utility boards. cooperative utility boards, municipal utility boards. I'm a proud member of Benco Electric, a rural electric co-op in my district. It is member-driven. The boards are member-elected. At our annual luncheon, we have as many as 1,800 members, and let me tell you, these are the folks that you see coaching Little League, working in town, helping out, volunteering, and they are serious about electing boards that know what they're doing. The boards of our utilities in Minnesota are extremely dedicated to their members and to price and affordability. And this bill is empowering them to make change that we will be bragging about to not only all of our children and grandchildren, but all Minnesotans as we take this step. And I offer this partnership with those boards to say, we are often told you can't do this. We're often said that's impossible. I say no. I say we can do it, and Minnesota can be a leader, and the passage of House File 7 is exactly how we signal all those Minnesotans who said that climate change and us taking responsible steps can do it. And with that, Mr. President, I ask members to consider a green vote on House File 7. Thank you.
Senator Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, members. Members, before you today is the Minnesota blackout bill. The bill that will increase the chance of putting more Minnesotans at risk with not only the reliability of the grid and the energy production we do here in Minnesota, but also increase the cost of what Minnesotans will be paying under the new policies that are enacted in this plan. Unfortunately, the Democrat majority has decided to push for strict mandates on Minnesota's utilities to a carbon-free energy at a pace that current technology cannot support or does not support today. And I have asked groups from large utilities to small in my office, what does it look like for you to accomplish this standard? And I have not gotten one affirmative response saying, yep, we know how we can do it. The large utilities like Xcel are in the best position that likely will be able to do that on their own, but they're way ahead of where small co-ops, small municipals, and smaller utilities across the state of Minnesota do not have a good path forward with what they have and the customers that they serve to accomplish this. So simply hoping for a clean energy technology in the future to come around, such as batteries to be the magic glue for wind and solar, hoping that is not a plan. Members, without access to reliable forms of energy, Minnesota's energy grid will not be able to keep up with demand on peak times. And members, the times where we will be most likely to have reliability questions, where we'll be at the strongest risk of grid failures, of brownouts, of rolling blackouts, will be either during the hottest summer days or the coldest winter nights. The times when you most need your energy to be on will be the times when the reliability of your energy will be at its lowest. And the way that this bill is weakening access to reliable energy is that it is removing from Minnesota's mix many of the strong, concrete, baseload generation forms that provide the strong foundation for the energy that we use today, that we're using right now, and that we've been using for years. By removing our gas plants today off of the mix, retiring our traditional plants. We have the 2 nuclear plants that are today, but if we're moving this direction, we will need to have more nuclear facilities in the mix. Big hydro needs to be in the mix for a baseload form of energy. It's a simple math problem, members. What we have here is a subtraction of the baseload forms of energy, particularly gas and coal and the peaking plants and these large traditional facilities. And we are adding weather-dependent, unreliable renewables, wind and solar, that are largely dependent on the weather. Right now, I checked, I'd encourage you all to check the MISO real-time updates that show how much of our energy that we're using in real time is coming from a variety of sources. And today, right now, members, today, February 2nd, is an abnormally high day of wind generation. Today, wind is doing really well. And now, what is the standard that shows that it is a good wind day today? Well, it's over 20% of our generation mix right now. The largest amount of energy that we're using right now comes from coal, natural gas, nuclear. That's the base foundation that we have that is powering our energy right now. Solar right now is producing barely over 1% of the energy that we are using right now. And so, members, this blackout bill is moving us away from the 85% of our energy mix, the nuclear, the gas, the coal, and moving us towards the 5 to 25% wind and solar. That math just simply will not add up. And just claiming that we'll just add more renewables, a lot more solar on the mix. Members, 100 times 0 is still 0. If you have a lot more weather-dependent energy forms, they will all go down at the same time when the weather is not favorable for generating energy in those conditions. The sun is not always shining, the wind is not always blowing, and these forms of energy are what this bill is going to push us onto. So when we go onto that unreliable form of energy, what's going to be the recourse? Well, Minnesotans are going to have to buy reliable energy from other states around us in the region in order to make up the deficit that we'll be self-imposing on ourselves here in Minnesota. And we'll be subject to pay what the cost will be. And members, when you're at 20, 30 degrees below 0 on a cold winter night, or if you're at 95, 100 degrees on a summer day, that is when each individual unit price of energy will be at its highest. Energy is pretty cheap on a nice 30-degree day, a nice 70-degree summer day when everything is running normally and all of our forms of energy are humming along at a normal generation level. But when we have a high or a low, not only is that when the reliability will be most impacted, but the cost that we'll have to pay to make up the difference will be at its highest. That cost ends up having to get footed by the ratepayers in order to cover the energy that we are buying. So experts that have examined the Walz plan of his clean energy goals, this blackout bill plan that's in here, they estimate that for the average residential Minnesota household, it will eventually cost, by the time we get to full implementation of this bill, it will cost as much as $1,600 to $1,800 more per year just in the energy cost you see on your monthly bill. And that will make it much harder for Minnesotans to afford the basic needs in their own home. And Mr. President and members, that does not even take into account all the trickle-down effects that these rising energy costs will impose, because rising energy costs will then make your groceries more expensive, it will make your goods more expensive, it will make the cost to ship goods from the manufacturer to the stores where you buy them, that cost will be higher. Energy has the trickle-down effect of touching just about every single segment of our economy. Every good we buy, every service we pay for, every type of food that we purchase to eat, all of those get impacted by energy. And when energy costs go up, the cost of all of those goods and services also have to go up. So not only does Minnesota families end up bearing the burden of larger monthly statements, likely to the tune of $1,600 to $1,800 a year, but there will be the added costs of all the increased costs of the goods, the food, the services that they end up paying for. We all support these advancing technologies, and I have long said that I have no problem with wind and solar generation, and people have built it. They've brought it into our area. It is a much greater part of our energy mix and our energy portfolio today than it was years ago. But this bill is not leading us to an all-of-the-above energy approach. It is targeting certain renewable technologies, a lot of preference for wind and solar going into the future, and we just cannot leave families out in the cold. We should continue to pursue an all-of-the-above energy strategy, and as these renewable technologies gain in strength, hopefully gain in efficiency, as new technologies, some that probably aren't even conceptualized today or are in the early stages that are still a long ways from implementation, the market will naturally work to include these in higher numbers and make them a part of our energy portfolio. And so the Senate Republican plan that we would be bringing, if we could this session, would be an A+ energy plan. Our plan would be allowing all forms of baseload energy, particularly nuclear. We would need to have the nuclear moratorium lifted and have that be a part of the energy portfolio and allow our utilities and producers to consider and plan and see if more nuclear energy, if a small modular nuclear reactor, if some technology, if maybe not even the first generation advanced nuclear, maybe the second generation down the road makes sense to put in our energy mix. We would need to allow for that. It would be affordable. Affordable energy has to be a keystone component. The math just does not show that with what the blackout bill proposal puts before us. The cheapest forms of energy are our reliable baseload generation, not what is dependent on the weather or intermittent wind and solar. And you can pinpoint any one point in time saying, hey, look, the price here for wind at this point in time is cheaper. You have to step back and look at a whole. The natural consequences of going this route means you're going to be paying a high premium for baseload power from outside our state borders to make up the difference. So no, it's not correct to say that the renewable energy here is the cheapest and we can just multiply it to multiple degrees to add that all into our mix. When it all goes low because of weather, then we end up paying for it in what we make up. The third A in the A+ energy plan is always on, reliability. We would ensure reliability by having multiple forms of strong concrete baseload generation types in the mix. That would include nuclear, that would include big hydro, that would include our gas plants that we have to have available in the mix. And the fourth would be an all-of-the-above approach. We would not be saying no to any one technology. Wind and solar are fine being a part of the mix. But the blackout bill plan that we have here today is not an all-of-the-above approach. It picks out some forms of energy, and it will exclude other forms of other plants that we have operating today. So the plan before you is going to replace baseload energy with intermittent, less reliable energy, and that math will just not add up. And there are no real off-ramps that are in this bill. The author and the majority has talked about the off-ramps that we can take in order to get off of this plan if we can't achieve this. And I have asked groups and utilities, what would a situation or a circumstance actually look like that would qualify to get you off the off-ramp if this doesn't pan out the way that the majority is hoping it pans out. And the only one who can come up with a good answer to that, to me, was Xcel Energy. They gave me a scenario that would likely fit the criteria, but Xcel is the least likely entity that's going to have to use the off-ramp because they're in the best position right now with their monopoly control on the jurisdiction they have and the power they produce. They're going to be fine under this plan. They're likely going to achieve it. But the groups that are going to need an off-ramp, local municipalities, a local co-op, those with a small municipal generator that is the source of powering a town in small town Minnesota. That's where I am from the city of Princeton. We have a diesel generator in that town. Heard of one yesterday in northern Minnesota. That's a small muni wood generator. These other groups do not have a good way to get to this 100% standard and do not have any confidence that their concerns would be heard by the Public Utilities Commission. Saying go to the commission, and if they rule against you anyway, sue the commission, is not an off-ramp. What this blackout bill has are off-ramps in the future with exit closed signs in front of it for the small munis and co-ops that are most likely going to need it. And we brought to committee concrete, tangible amendments of tangible actions that we all could recognize that if we meet these standards and these criteria, that would get us off the off-ramp. And they were rejected on party line votes. So the technology that this bill is seeking to propose is not neutral. It is favoring some forms of renewable energy, shutting out other forms, and the bipartisanship that the author claims on this bill just has not borne out in the actual discussion surrounding this bill. Sure, there's been a few small pieces that have been given to some groups, such as the co-ops. Yes, they are glad that the standard for 7 years from now at 2030 is, what, 60% instead of 80%? But that's mere breadcrumbs in the scope of things with the size of this bill. And they still then have a steeper ramp up. They still have to get to 90 by 2035. They still have to get to 100 by 2040. And while they came and said that they were neutral on the bill, there are still many grave concerns. There is a clear unequal bargaining power between the people in the majorities and in the governor's office now and the actual companies and utilities that are tasked with actually putting power in people's homes so that the lights stay on and the heat stays warm. And the negotiations have not borne that out, and there's not been one single Republican amendment that the majority has even been willing to consider. We're acting like this is a special session trifecta, that three people, a governor and the speaker and the majority leader got behind closed doors, made a deal, and they're like, here's the deal, and you all have to vote for it. We're in January, now we're in early February, members, and we are pushing this bill through, saying we can't make changes to it, like we're in a special session deadline trifecta, and we're not listening to the concerns of many Minnesotans and groups around the state of Minnesota. And that is problematic. That is not good governance. Even if I disagree with the policy that you want to pass on Minnesotans, you could be doing it in a way that would be a good governance way for Minnesota, and the majority has not even been willing to meet that standard. Members, I'll close with this. There were two news articles. I've got them somewhere in this, I'm sure I've got them somewhere in this pile of papers on my desk. But just earlier this week, the Star Tribune ran an article about how Minnesota is seeing carbon and greenhouse gas reductions here lately in the last few years. And it was interesting that the Star Tribune even pointed out one of the key reasons that has driven this reduction in carbon emissions, which has been the goal loudly said by many people, shared by a broad spectrum in Minnesota, that both sides in this aisle have pushed for in the past with our energy policies. They stated that one of the key drivers behind the reduction of the carbon emissions has been the natural gas power plants and gas facilities that we have in the state of Minnesota, as well as other renewables like wind and solar. But gas is a key piece in getting the goals that the majority is even stating as one of their important goals. Unfortunately, gas is going to be left on the outside looking in under this proposal, either shut down altogether or in exchange for continuing to run your gas plant, you're going to have to build expensive renewables that you don't need or buy a renewable energy credit just because the government says you have to. And in both of those scenarios, that adds to the cost that the ratepayer ends up having to pay for their plan and for their monthly bill. And so the Star Tribune even recognized natural gas as an important piece in the carbon reductions. It should not be left in the cold under this blackout bill. And finally, members, I'll close with this. Even last summer, the MISO energy, the MISO grid operators last summer told Minnesota that the Minnesota grid already in the summer of 2022, last summer, is at a significant increased risk of rolling blackouts, of brownouts, of grid shortages. The margin of safety of the amount of energy we're generating in this state is reducing to dangerously low levels. Under this blackout bill, we are going further in the wrong direction, where the energy we'll generate will be less, while the demand for energy that we need will be more. And it's unfortunate that the majority has decided that even in the face of potential blackouts and brownouts, of an increased risk of that happening, they said not only for 2022, but also 23 and 24, we are going to take, it's unfortunate that we are going to take this plan that will reduce the amount of electricity we generate while increasing the demand of energy that we need. And that's simple economics 101, members. That math is not going to add up, either with a reliability failure or an affordability failure. So, members, Mr. President, we are going to give the majority ample time to actually do what they have proposed they're doing with the underlying bill, to make it bipartisan and to make it technology neutral and to make it affordable for all members. We have done that in the past. When we did the 2007 Renewable Energy Standard, the majorities, and it was a split government even at the time, they took their time, they did the work, they spent a lot of time making sure they listened to all the parties that were involved, and they worked through to get to a solution that an overwhelming majority in both bodies of this legislature ended up supporting the final product. That is not what this majority has chosen to do. We are rushing through this bill at lightning speed on just hyper-partisan support and shutting out the voices of the minority. So we're going to give you many chances today, Mr. President and members, to actually do what the majority is proposing to do with this bill. The blackout bill will not be affordable, will not be reliable, will cause a lot of problems for the people of Minnesota. And I encourage the majority to take many of our amendments. And if this bill remains in the shape that it is, I will be urging members to vote no on the underlying blackout bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Rarick.
Thank you, Mr. President. We've heard a lot about this bill, and I know the chief author said it's been around a while. I've been involved in the energy sector here at the legislature in the whole time I've been here, that full 8 years. Started in the House carrying a bill that we called the ECO Act. This was a bill that transformed a conservation improvement program here in Minnesota. At first it was very controversial. It took a lot of engagement with the folks in the utilities, with the ratepayer groups who represented workers. We worked on that bill for 4 years to get it to a point where there was agreement. And in a divided legislature, passed it with overwhelming support. Members, that is not happening with this bill today. I do agree that this bill has been presented in the past. but it has not gone through the discussions that so many other energy proposals have gone through at this legislature. And for so many members of both chambers that have been here for only weeks, to think that they have caught up to the level they need to be to act on policy this far-reaching, I think we're overwhelming them with the speed that we're moving this bill and not allowing time for the people of Minnesota to even understand what's truly in this bill that we're voting on today. You know, I respectfully disagree with the chief author and a number of the other comments that have been made on the introduction of this bill. The first one, when we hear that this bill is going to reduce emissions. As someone who works in the trades, I have a very hard time with that. This legislation in and of itself does nothing. Technology is what will move us to a carbon-free energy future. The people who work in the fields developing those technologies and installing those technologies are what get us to a carbon-free energy future. And we can talk about we will encourage that with this legislation, but I would challenge that there are a number of other things we could encourage with this legislation that we will get to later that are not in this bill. I disagree with the comment that this is agnostic to technologies. As Senator Matthews says earlier, this very much encourages and puts wind and solar at a higher level than many of the other technologies. Technologies that we rely on today for that base power load. You will hear me probably repeatedly today say what I've been saying for the last 5 years when it comes to the conversation on energy. We can be good stewards, and we can move towards that carbon-free energy future. But we also have to maintain affordability, and we need to maintain reliability. Minnesotans cannot afford huge increases in costs, and they expect, when they turn the light switch on, that the lights, in fact, will come on. Another portion of the bill that was discussed that I respectfully disagree with is when we talk about the expedited process for some permitting. That is pertaining to one very specific piece in the whole picture of our energy future. It only addresses transmission. Members, Mr. President, there are so many other pieces to this puzzle that are not getting that same qualification. The piece I want to specifically address first, though, is with the discussion of the off-ramps. Mr. President, we heard in the opening remarks that the off-ramps are based on reliability and affordability. Current statute had a number of off-ramps that dealt just with that. What we have in this bill today is an addition of many new criteria that must be met in order to get those off-ramps. So not only are we putting in standards that our municipals and our co-ops have told us they are going to struggle to achieve, we are in the same breath making those off-ramps for them much more difficult. And so with that, Mr. President, I would like to offer the A43 amendment.
Senator Rarick offers the A43 amendment. At the appropriate time, the Secretary will report the amendment. And members, if I can just remind you and ask you graciously, if you have an amendment, the earlier that you could give it to us, just so the staff can find it, because there are a number of amendments here. Thank you. Secretary will report the amendment.
Senator Rarick moves to amend House File Number 7 as follows. Page 5, lines 9 to 19, delete the new language. This is the A43 amendment.
Senator Rarick. Oh, I'm sorry. Senator Westland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to request a roll call vote.
Roll call requested, roll call granted. Senator Rarick.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, this is one of the parts to these new criteria that must be met for these off-ramps that have been talked about that is going to be incredibly difficult for our municipals and our co-ops to achieve. But as I heard the discussion and everything, I want to address this all. So, Mr. President, I would offer the A59 amendment to the amendment that goes a little further than just what the A42.
Senator Rarick offers the A59 amendment to the amendment. At the appropriate time, the Secretary will report the amendment. Senator Westland.
Mr. President, I request a roll call vote.
Roll call vote has been requested. Roll call granted. I'm sorry. Report the amendment.
Senator Rarick moves to amend the A43 amendment to House File Number 7 as follows. Page 1, line 2, delete 19 and insert 31. This is the A59 amendment.
Senator Rarick, to your A59 amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. And just so it is official, I would request a roll call if it is now the proper time. So, Mr. President, the A59 amendment is going to address all of the new requirements needed for the off-ramps for our utilities. And as Senator Matthews talked about, Xcel Energy has weighed in and they believe these off-ramps are all right. But they already had goals and plans in place to be 100% carbon-free by 2050. This bill in general does speed that up. They have to get there 10 years sooner. But they are well positioned to make these earlier standards. They are not going to need these off-ramps. But I've heard from my small cooperatives and municipals that this is going to be incredibly difficult. And yes, they have an opportunity to buy RECs, renewable energy credits, but that comes at a cost to their ratepayers. And these municipals and co-ops, those extra costs go right to their members, the ratepayers, increasing their costs. The board members on these municipals and co-ops have heard from their members and from Minnesota. They are working on plans to get to that 100% carbon free. But it is far more difficult for them. And they knew they had reliable off-ramps that they could do the calculations. They could go to the PUC specifically showing them why they couldn't make it. These new requirements that are in this bill are vague and under the interpretation of one person's opinion or another as to what some of the costs are going to be. So, Mr. President, I would ask members adopt this if you truly are concerned about the costs, that affordability, and the reliability that our especially co-ops and municipals are going to need, that we would adopt this amendment so that if they truly cannot make these standards, they can still keep that energy mix affordable and reliable for their members. Thank you, Mr. President.
Members, we're on the amendment to the amendment, the A59. Senator Friends?
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Rarick. To the A59 amendment, Mr. President, I would ask members to vote no. The changing of the off-ramp frustrates the effort of us to reach a coalition and consensus. I've put the letters on your desk members, that allow you to see the individual responses, but I would call your attention to the Laborers International Union of North America. This is not an energy group. This is a group of working men and women. And if you look at their letter, it says LIUNA could not support legislation committing the state to pursue full decarbonization of our electric grid if we were not confident that Minnesota utilities would be able to meet new requirements while delivering affordable, reliable power. Mr. President, the reason we should vote no on the A59 is that the off-ramps provided in the bill would allow a municipal or a co-op to go to the PUC to make those arguments, and I call members' attention to the sheet from LIUNA and others that say that the bill will provide affordability and reliability. Thank you, Mr. President.
Any further discussion? I want to go to the author last if there's anyone. Senator Matthews, to the A59 amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, I would urge members to support the A59 amendment because we should help the small utilities to meet the standard that they already want to make. Mr. President, it should not be considered if an outside group that's not tasked with providing energy says that they think that the standard can be met. You need to go right to the generating companies themselves, and they are the ones with the questions, and they are the ones with the concerns. And it's nonsensical to say, well, an outside builder group says they can, therefore let's take their word at it that they can. Let's go right to the source of these munis and co-ops that say, here's a path forward that allows us to meet the goal that you want at a pace that we can afford, that our customers can afford, and that still eventually meets these same goals. So members, let's have a little bit of compassion and common sense in your hearts. Some places in Minnesota are much better prepared to meet some of these standards than others. This is a very common sense amendment, and I'd urge members to vote yes.
Senator Gruenhagen, to the amendment, which is A59, before I go to the author.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, I rise in support of the Rarick amendment, and you know, I have to voice the concerns from my district, also of my co-ops. I've heard from them. They have a lot of concern about this bill and their ability to meet it, and also the idea that if they don't meet it, they're going to have to buy RECs, and that's going to drive up the cost of electricity to their constituents. So if Senator Friends would yield for a question.
Senator Friends, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Gruenhagen, to the A59 amendment.
Okay, thank you, Mr. President. Yes, Senator Friends, I wish you would support this amendment to amendment. I do appreciate some of the moves that you made inside this bill and some of the accommodation. You have shown a certain amount of flexibility. But, you know, when we look at California, which has gone down this road much further ahead than what Minnesota is, we look to England, we look to much of Europe, but especially Germany, we see that it produces a disastrous road with severe economic consequences and human suffering. And now we see those countries, especially in Europe, Germany and England, are backing away from this type of approach because it just is not practical without strong base load electricity as a foundation. So my question to you, Senator Friends, is based on the overwhelming evidence by countries who have gone down this path, wouldn't it be reasonable to help out some of these rural co-ops to accommodate the direction you want to take us rather than vote no on this amendment?
Senator Friends, to the amendment, A59.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Gruenhagen. To the A59, I believe we should vote no on the A59 amendment. But to your question, Senator Gruenhagen, I think we should do everything we can once this bill is passed to work with municipals and co-ops, not only on the questions of their specific situation given their size And by the way, members of the minority party, I appreciate what sounds like a bit of a concession on the point that our largest utility, XL Energy, will be able to meet this standard. I believe they serve 1.7 million Minnesotans, and I think those 1.7 million are going to be very pleased to hear that we have reached some agreement on that point. But Senator Gruenhagen, I went to Germany and toured their energy facilities, and by the way, Senator Pratt and former Senator Senjum are with me. I like the direction they're going, especially on the cost side. And for reliability, I think those are the very reasons we have the current off-ramp. If a municipality has an electric company and they cannot meet it, they can go to the PUC and maybe they can only get to 95%. And in that instance, Mr. President, under the bill's current language, that municipal utility will be allowed to get the off-ramp, and that's exactly the point of the bill, and it is meant to recognize those utilities who, are, for whatever reason, will not be able to meet it. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Gruenhagen.
Senator Gruenhagen, to the amendment, the A59.
Oh, thank you,
So
Mr.
we want to go to the author.
Yep. Yeah, and thanks for that response, Senator Friends. Again, I appreciate a few of the accommodations that you have made in this and compromise that you've shown in here to try to at least send a little bit of a message toward baseload electricity. But I would advise you to do your current research on England and Germany, and you'll find they're backing away from the type of approach you're putting in here. So much of this bill, in my opinion, can be compared to driving down a road at midnight with your lights off, knowing there's a cliff in front of you, okay? We don't have the technology available to accomplish these goals. In my opinion, it's not going to do anything as far as addressing any type of climate change. And we need some of these amendments, like Senator Rarick's, to put some reasonableness back into this bill. So members, I urge a green vote. Thank you, Mr. President.
And I'm going to the author. I have one before you, author. Senator Pratt, to the A59 amendment to the amendment.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Senator Frantz. I was expecting to reminisce about our trip to Germany a little later today, but and I will. But as we toured the electric generation in Germany, I remember sitting next to a former Bundestag member, Baba Hohn, who, while we were having dinner, we were talking about energy and carbon emissions, and she shared with me that while Germany was far exceeding their goals on renewable energy, they were falling behind on their carbon reduction goals, and that they were still needing to generate more and import more energy from places like France and Russia. So, Mr. President, as I look at how limited the eligible technology is in Senate File 4 or House File 7, I'm concerned that the off-ramps are going to be too difficult and too costly for us to achieve. I think Senator Matthews and Senator Rarick have the right idea on these off-ramps to make sure that we are not getting ahead of the technology, that we are not getting ahead of the energy need, because right now, we don't have the luxury of picking which energy uses we want all the time. We need more. We need an all-of-the-above strategy, and I appreciate Senator Matthews laying out an A-plus energy plan to assure Minnesota businesses and Minnesota families can go to bed at night knowing that their furnaces and air conditioners will work, that their food will stay healthy and unspoiled, that the companies that they go to work for will stay in this state because energy is affordable and reliable. And so, Mr. President, I appreciate Senator Rarick bringing this amendment, and I encourage members to vote yes.
To the author, Senator Rarick, to the amendment, the A59, and then the secretary will take the roll once he finishes.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. I would encourage a yes vote on the A59 amendment to the amendment. Again, this is not getting rid of off-ramps. This is getting rid of the new requirements for the off-ramps that are going to make it far more difficult for our small utilities when they cannot meet these standards. And one more thing that I would like members to think about before they make this vote. If these off-ramps are too difficult for them when they can't make the standard, they're going to end up needing to buy RECs, renewable energy credits. And they're either going to buy them from Xcel or they're going to buy them from a utility generating in another state. And what's going to happen is the fossil fuel generation that those utilities have typically used, on paper they're going to get used somewhere else, and renewables on paper will get used in those areas. We will not actually be reducing any emissions. That will not be getting us towards the real end goal. But having these off-ramps allows our utilities to each continue towards their plans that will actually have impacts within their energy users area. Thank you, Mr. President.
The Secretary will take the roll on the A59 amendment, which is the amendment to the amendment. Please vote, members. The Secretary will close the roll. There have been 33 ayes and 34 noes. The amendment is not adopted. We are now on the underlining amendment, which is the A43 amendment. Senator Rarick, I want to make sure there's no one else that wants to speak, so you can be the last one. Are you okay with that? Thank you so much. Anyone else? Senator Rarick.
Thank you, Mr. President. And that was a little disappointing, but the underlying amendment still has the piece that was the most troubling for me and for our municipals and co-ops as far as the new off-ramp criteria. So I would ask that on the underlying A43 amendment, members vote yes. This is the one that is going to take so much time and so much effort if our utilities are actually going to be able to use any of the off-ramps. This is the one that we should absolutely strike from the language so they truly have an option when they cannot meet these standards. Thank you, Mr. President.
The Secretary will take the roll. Members, remember this is the amendment A43. Please vote. Members, please vote. The Secretary will close the roll. There being 33 ayes and 34 noes, the amendment is not adopted. Members, just a gentle reminder, once you get up to speak, I'll still let you say whatever you want to say, but if you can help the front desk out by letting us know what the amendment is, because they have to find it. Senator Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, the batting average is still 0. We're 0 for 1 so far, but here's your 0 for 2 actually. But here's your next shot. Mr. President, I'd like to offer the A44 amendment.
Senator Matthews offers the A44 amendment. At the appropriate time, the Secretary will report that amendment. Senator Westland.
Senator Matthews moves to amend House File Number 7 as follows. Page 2, line 25, strike 100 and insert 200. This is the A44 amendment.
Sorry about that, Mr. Secretary. Senator Westland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to request a roll call.
Roll call requested. Roll call granted. Senator Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. President. The A44 amendment moves the RES qualifying threshold from 100 megawatts to 200 megawatts. But in addition to that, Mr. President, I would like to offer the A62 amendment to the amendment.
Senator Matthews offers the A52 amendment.
62.
62 offers the A62 amendment to the amendment. At the appropriate time, the Secretary will report the amendment.
Senator Matthews moves to amend the A44 amendment to House File Number 7 as follows. Page 1, delete line 2 and insert. This is the A62 amendment.
And Mr.
Senator
President,
Westland?
I'll request a roll call.
Well, you both are going to ask the same thing, it looks like. Senator Matthews, go ahead.
Mr. President, I'll request a roll call on the A62 amendment.
Roll call has been requested and a roll call granted. Senator Matthews, to your A62 amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. So when I first read the underlying bill, this was the one good piece that I thought was in there at first, because it exactly matched language that I had carried several sessions ago and even got a hearing on in the Energy Committee. And this relates to the hydroelectric piece, because under current statute, hydro being counted as renewable energy is capped at the 100 megawatt limit. I brought a bill forward that would remove that cap because hydro is a completely clean source of baseload energy. It's very reliable. It is much more reliable than the weather-dependent sources, and it was just seemed silly to me that we artificially capped it for renewable energy in our standard. So I put in a bill. I even got a hearing 1 year on it, had bipartisan support in that committee to remove that cap. The underlying bill, the first version of it, Mr. Chair, had that same hydro language that removed the cap, and I went, wow, here's one little piece that is good in the midst of this bad blackout bill. But then we got to committee and an amendment came, and what had gone 2 steps forward came 1 step backwards. And more restrictions got put in around the hydro language, limiting it to new hydro. Members, Mr. President, the A62 amendment goes back to what the first version of the bill was, what is the most common sense way of handling this strong baseload form of energy with hydroelectricity. It says count it as renewable energy. Don't put in a silly government-mandated artificial cap on it. Don't limit it to just the hydro that we have today. If a technology comes up in the future that has a good hydro source of energy somewhere else down the road, why would we artificially cap ourselves and limit ourselves from accessing that if it makes sense and if it's affordable to do so? So this is to fix and put back what I thought was going to be one good piece in the blackout bill. And as I said, it started out 2 steps forward. It went 1 step back in committee. This is to take that final step forward and make hydroelectricity a true renewable energy resource recognized in Minnesota statute without any silly government artificial cap on it. I urge members' support for the amendment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Any further discussion on the A62 amendment? Senator Friends.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Matthews. While I agree with you that hydroelectric power is most definitely a carbon-free source, and I appreciate you recognizing the original change in the bill from the previous incarnation, The reason this is in there, members, is that there is a significant environmental justice issue with hydroelectric power over 100 megawatts. And in order to keep the stakeholders together in support of this bill, that limitation is in the bill, and I would urge members to vote no on the A62 amendment to the A44 for that reason, Mr. President. Thank you.
And before I call on the author of the amendment last, Senator Rarick.
Thank you, Mr. President. And to that point that was just brought up, the ecological impacts, I think we could talk about the ecological impacts of wind turbines and solar arrays as well. So, I mean, if we're truly after carbon-free, hydro is one of those sources, and if this bill is going to be agnostic to all sources of generation, then we should adopt this amendment so that hydro is on the same plane as solar and wind. Thank you, Mr. President.
Anyone else before the author of the amendment? I want to make sure that we give him the respect to be able to be last. Senator Matthews to the A62 amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. So if you're going to reject this underlying amendment and you want to stick with the language in the bill before you, then you can't call this bill technology neutral, because the bill has an artificial cap on a source of technology, and it's from one source. I've heard some of the discussion around the big hydro in Manitoba, but we're artificially limiting ourselves. If there's another hydro source that comes from somewhere else, we won't access that under this language. We are imposing a silly, nonsensical, government-imposed artificial cap on hydroelectricity, recognizing it in the state of Minnesota. It'd be a mistake if you reject the amendment, then don't call it technology neutral anymore, because the technology that's in the bill is limited to a limit or to a certain source of where that hydro can come from, and thus it is not a truly technology neutral scenario. So with that, members, I'd urge you to support the A62 amendment.
The Secretary will take the roll on the amendment to the amendment, the A62. Members, please vote. Members, pursuant to Rule 14.1, the following members will be voting under Rule 40.7. Senator Port. So Senator Kunis to report.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Port votes no.
Senator Port votes no. The Secretary will close the roll. There being 31 ayes and 34 noes, the amendment to the amendment is not adopted. I'm sorry, 33 ayes and 34 noes, the amendment is not adopted. Senator Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, the batting average is still sitting at 0. Spring training's around the corner, and you don't want your players to get off to that kind of start. So give you one more shot, Mr. President. The A44 amendment allows you, if you don't want to take the full, go 2 steps forward, we can go a small step forward with the A44 amendment to make the level a 200 megawatt level. That will be a 2-for-1 deal. We can get twice the amount of electricity generated from this hydroelectric source included in Minnesota as renewable energy. It's strong, it's reliable, it's base load, it's not dependent on the weather. It will help power the lights and the heat in your home. And if we're going to start restricting the amount of generation that we have in Minnesota, let's increase this one form with hydroelectric and vote to pass the A44 amendment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Friends.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Matthews. Senator Matthews, you are batting 1,000 at understanding the topic that we have at hand, and you are a quality advocate for the positions that you like. And I look forward to the batting average reflecting your nuclear advanced study bill being heard in my committee on Monday, where it will have my yes vote. However, members, I would suggest a no vote on the A44 amendment. Thank you.
Was there a roll call requested on this bill?
Roll call requested, Mr. President.
Roll call requested, roll call granted. I thought there was. I just wanted to be sure. The secretary would take the roll. We are on the A44 amendment. Please vote, members. Senator Kunis, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Mr. President, Senator Port votes no.
Senator Port votes no. Senator Kunis, can you clarify city and state for Senator Port?
Mr. President, Senator Port is in Burnsville, Minnesota.
Burnsville, Minnesota. Sorry for that delay. The secretary will close the roll. There being 33 ayes and 34 noes, the amendment is not adopted. Senator Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. President. So, next, I would like to offer the A45 amendment.
Senator Matthews offers the A45 amendment. At the appropriate time, the secretary will report the amendment.
Senator Matthews moves to amend House File Number 7 as follows. Page 19, after line 31, insert. This is the A45 amendment.
Senator Matthews, to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll request a roll call on the A45 amendment.
Roll call vote. Request a roll call granted. Senator Matthews.
Mr. President, members, the A45 amendment is going to address another part that's going to be crucial for this standard as you're moving forward. Right now, Minnesotans and ratepayers have invested a lot of money into building the infrastructure of many of these electric generation facilities around the state that include gas, that include coal, that include a number of things. And Minnesotans have already paid for that. We've paid for that in the rates that we've been paying on our monthly bill, and those monies have gone towards the building and the maintenance of these facilities. And many of these facilities are being retired early, which means Minnesotans are not getting the full value of the purchase that they made. It's like going to the car salesman to buy a vehicle that you're expecting to drive for the next 10 years, and you pay the full price of the vehicle, planning on it lasting you for 10 years' time. If you only drive that vehicle for 4 or 5 years, and then you're forced to move on to another vehicle after that, you have not gotten the full value out of the item that you purchased at your expectation when you purchased it. And so we're doing that across the state of Minnesota with the early retirement of many of our baseload generation facilities, and it is going to make it more expensive for Minnesotans because they've not been getting the full value of what they purchased with the initial construction of these plants. So the A45 amendment is going to say that for these generation facilities around Minnesota, let's hold off on the demolition. Let's not allow any permanent demolition or removal of these facilities. And with that, Mr. President, I'm also going to offer the A63 amendment to the amendment.
Senator Matthews offers the A63 amendment to the amendment. At the appropriate time, the Secretary will report your amendment, Senator, and then you will explain it. Thank you.
Senator Matthews moves to amend the A45 amendment to House File Number 7 as follows. Page 1, line 5, delete 5, and insert 10. This is the A63 amendment.
Senator Matthews, to your A63 amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. And the A63 changes it from a 5-year period to a 10-year period, and here's why. This is to help Minnesota avoid mistakes that places in Europe like Germany and such almost made. There was a big move to largely renewable energy in Europe, and the way that where they reached out of their borders to buy the baseload energy that they needed to supplement their own nation's renewable energy mix was buying natural gas from Russia. Well, about a year ago, that turned out to be a serious mistake that had a fatal flaw in that plan, because when Russia started the war against Ukraine, suddenly we realized that we couldn't be spending all this money buying gas from Russia, and in many cases, they simply cut it off in order to fund their war effort. It wasn't for sale. And so these countries in Europe that had built into their plan, oh, we'll have renewables and we'll pat ourselves on the back that we're a 100% renewable energy country, and all we'll need to do is keep buying this beautiful Russian gas that we have over here to fill in the gaps and build our foundation. Suddenly that became a really bad plan. And because Europe had not raised and demolished some of their traditional baseload generation plants, they had to revert to repower these facilities back up, refire them back into operation, and use them instead as the foundation for their energy generation. They did this in the face of the long, dark, cold winter that was warned about, how so many people across Europe could be suffering from the cold because of the war. That became a possibility. It was less so because they had these facilities on hand ready to fire up and reconstitute, and that avoided the disaster and tragedy that could have been if these facilities had been removed. And so this underlying amendment is to encourage us to take a longer range view in mind. We're moving up to 2040. The majority wants to push their blackout bill that will harm affordability and will harm reliability, and there is a good chance that there are groups that aren't going to make this standard. And a way that they can fill in the difference, a way that they could present to the public utilities to get to an off-ramp would be to say, these facilities that we had here that are very clean, this gas facility that we had burning clean energy on this location some years ago, we can fire this back up and use this to fill in the gaps of the baseload generation that we need. So if you do retire a car, Mr. President, if you're planning to drive it 10 years and after 4 or 5 a fancier car catches your eye and you buy that, and maybe you revert your old car to your secondary vehicle, that still makes some sense. You have it there if you need it. Maybe your first car has to go to the shop and get a repair and you fall back on your secondary vehicle, but it'd be foolish to take your old car right to the crushers the moment that you have your new car when there's still a lot of life left in it. That's essentially the goal that we are getting at with this amendment. It's common sense. It would help us avoid making some of the disastrous mistakes that Europe almost made, and I'd urge members to support the A63 amendment to the amendment.
Senator Westland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I request a roll call.
Roll call has been requested. Roll call granted. Senator Friends.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Matthews. I have taken a look at the A63 amendment. I would ask members to vote no. This requires a political subdivision to make choices that they may not want to make. I think that decision is better left to the political subdivision. And with that, members, again, I would ask for a no vote on the A63 amendment. And Mr. President, if it wasn't already requested, I'd like a roll call on the underlying amendment, the A45, please.
It was requested. Senator Rarick.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, Senator Matthews spoke of a number of emergency situations that could arise, why this amendment is a good idea. But let's also speak to the fact that, to the affordability piece. We've talked about the idea that we need to keep energy affordable. And in this underlying bill, we say, oh, you can buy RECs from other places. And I think that will just drive up costs. The fact that these facilities exist, we should maintain them so that if we are making a mistake here by rushing this through so fast that we find out in the very near future that we cannot keep our energy affordable under this plan, we have a fallback to be able to get back to produce energy that is affordable for Minnesota citizens. I would suggest a yes vote.
Before I go to the author, I want to make sure that I have all those who want to speak on the list. Senator Duckworth.
Mr. President, thank you. I'm not on the Energy Committee, never have been, so I don't claim to be an expert by any means. And some of this I've been trying to immerse myself in and learn about. And from what I can tell, one of the biggest absolute concerns regarding the bill before us and specific to this amendment, I think what this amendment tries to get at is reliability. Reliability. If we're going to make some pretty significant changes regarding the state and the energy that it relies on, well, my goodness, we better make sure it's at least reliable. Now, here's the deal. I'm kind of a younger guy. I care about the environment. I grew up knowing and understanding it's important that we need to do our part to make sure that we're being responsible. I've even gone so far as to be one of those folks that got suckered into buying an electric lawnmower because I want to do my part. I'll even admit it, in Minnesota, don't call me wise, I also have an electric snowblower. But here's what I can tell you. I didn't give up the original gas lawnmower. I didn't give up the original gas snowblower, and for good reason. Sometimes when I fire each of those up to do the work I want to do, whether it's too hot or too cold or we just got too much snow, at some point those batteries drain out on occasion and die before I finish getting done what I need to. And at that point I have to revert to that old school form of reliable, dependable means of getting the job done. And I think that's what this amendment seeks to do. It's saying, hey, all right, if we're going to do this as a state, let's not completely disregard or get rid of those reliable means of producing energy for the state while we're trying to adapt to new technologies, because the increase in demand for electricity is also growing. So if we're going to move in that direction and become extremely dependent upon just electricity, it would be negligent of us to not ensure or give ourselves or give the state a little bit more time to still have those facilities that can be powered up on a moment's notice should we find ourselves in a severe weather event, which is why I think this amendment is extremely important. I'll give you another example specific to Minnesota, Mr. President. I'm almost done. If you own an electric vehicle, I don't, I have a hybrid, but if you have an electric vehicle, it's commonly known that in the state of Minnesota, the range on that electric vehicle during what is the very cold months of Minnesota significantly decreases and diminishes. And oftentimes you have to revert to a vehicle that's not solely reliant upon electricity. So sometimes we get so far in the weeds in these discussions that we fail to highlight the common sense idea we're trying to put before the people of Minnesota here, and that is to have reliable backup sources of energy and power for the state so that we don't find ourselves in a situation during a deep freeze where we've got people across the state without power, who are cold and in life-threatening situations. It's reasonable, it's common sense. Let's actually do some good work when it comes to this amendment. Thank you, Mr. President.
All right, I want to make sure there's no one else before I go to the author of the amendment. The author of the amendment, Senator Matthews, to the amendment, the A63.
Thank you, Mr. President. Again, I'd encourage members to consider what I said earlier. It's a common sense amendment. This makes sure that we have a backstop in place and make sure that we don't have a crisis or emergency where we've already taken away our own tools to be able to solve that emergency or keep people safe in a type of crisis. So I'd encourage members to vote yes on the amendment.
The Secretary will take the roll. We are on the amendment, the A63 amendment. Members, please vote. Senator Kunis, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Mr. President, Senator Port votes no.
Senator Port votes no. The Secretary will close the roll. There being 33 ayes and 34 noes, the amendment to the amendment is not adopted. We are now on the underlining A45 amendment. The last word, Senator Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. President. So let's take the halfway approach here and do something, let's come to a compromise here with this underlying amendment for a 5-year period. Members, again, it makes sense. It should be wise in our planning. It should be for our emergency preparation. And 5 years is not a long period of time in energy world because of how long-term the plans and processes are. Yet 5 years will get us a chunk into the future, approaching this 100% standard that the majority in their blackout bill is trying to propose. So with that, let's buy ourselves a margin of safety here with this amendment and vote yes on the A45. Thank you, Mr. President.
The Secretary will take the roll on the A45 amendment. Members, please vote. Senator Kunis, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Mr. President, Senator Port votes no.
Senator Port votes no. The Secretary will close the roll. There being 33 ayes and 34 noes, the amendment is not adopted. Senator Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. President. Give the majority another shot at making this truly a technology-neutral bill, because there are places in the bill, such as pages 2 and 3, that delineate what's in, and by reference, what's not on the list is out. And so the underlying bill and the underlying language picks winners and losers over certain renewable technology sectors. Here's another chance to rectify that and make this a truly technology-neutral bill. Mr. President, I would like to offer the A3 amendment.
Senator Matthews offers the A3 amendment, which is an amendment to the amendment. Nope, I'm sorry, is an amendment. The A3 amendment. The Secretary will report the amendment.
Senator Matthews moves to amend House File Number 7 as follows. Page 2, line 20, before the period, insert. This is the A3 amendment.
Senator Matthews to the A3 amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I'm going to request a roll call on the A3 amendment.
Roll call vote has been requested. Roll call granted. Senator Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. President. So the amendment does two things. One, it adds a line on the list that's already in the bill of what the allowable technology is under this standard, and it would add small modular nuclear reactors. And then the second section of the amendment gives an exception that the construction of small modular nuclear reactors can be considered for plans by our utilities that they bring forward to the Public Utilities Commission for study, for consideration, for planning purposes, to make sure where they have to go through the same process to prove the affordability for their ratepayers, the reliability, all of these same points, the same standard will still be in place. Nuclear, it has to be a key part of the future if you truly want a clean energy standard. And what technology is doing in the world of small modular nuclear reactors really is amazing. Mr. President, it's very unlikely that anyone will be building another type of facility that looks like the Prairie Island or the Monticello facility that we had from a generation ago. But the designs that they now have for these advanced reactors, the small modular nuclear reactor is very incredible. They can put them on small footprints, doesn't take up nearly the land that's required. They can have them much more reliable. The safety features that are on these blew my mind, even more so than what we have in our current generating facilities and how safe they are now. And so it just makes sense to have a small carve-out for small modular nuclear reactors in Minnesota law so that we can get the process started, so that utilities can plan, they can see if this makes sense to write a proposal together, bring it to the Public Utilities Commission, and try to move forward on this. This is not mandating that anybody does it. This is not requiring any new nuclear to be built, but this removes the obstacle that is today prohibiting utilities from even considering whether adding some more small modular nuclear in the state of Minnesota makes sense for the ratepayers and makes sense for the customers. So I urge members to vote yes on the A3 amendment.
We're on the A3 amendment. Senator Friends.
Thank you, Mr. President. Once again, thank you, Senator Matthews, for your advocacy. I would ask members to vote no on the A3 amendment. The Section 3 definitions of carbon-free are not all the types of energy that we could think of which are carbon-free. Me pulling a tire behind me is carbon-free energy. It's just not that much, Senator Pratt. However, the list is a subject of agreement amongst the stakeholders, Mr. President. And to your point, Senator Matthews, about picking winners, I believe the bill itself picks the people of Minnesota as winners, and I would ask members to vote no on the A3.
Senator Gruenhagen.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, I rise in support of Senator Matthews' amendment. You know, members, a few years ago, the USS Minnesota nuclear submarine was launched. I was invited to go down there. I couldn't. A few other, I think, senators and representatives did. But they brought me a book back on that. And in that book, it illustrated what it was powered by. And that nuclear sub, which, by the way, could almost come out of the ocean at a 90-degree angle. It was powered by nuclear material about the size of a human fist. Okay? The whole submarine. And according to the information, it will last for over 33 years. That's the potential that Senator Matthews is talking about here with small modular nuclear reactors. And again, do your research, members. According to the research, the nuclear waste, which unfortunately we cannot recycle, but other countries are around the world, you can now recycle it up to 97%. Unfortunately, we have a law passed during the Carter administration that prevents us from doing that, so we're stuck with the storage. So members, this is carbon-free, if you ascribe to that. It's base load, and the technology has advanced where it's relatively inexpensive. Now, I'm old enough to remember that when XL was NSP, and the ads were NSP electricity penny cheap. We're going from penny cheap to multi-dollar expensive. And this bill is going to promote rolling blackouts with any type of base load options like Senator Matthews is talking about. It's going to increase electricity costs at a time when families and businesses already are suffering, and it's especially going to hurt our rural small co-ops. So please, members, we're not mandating anything, as Senator Matthews said. We're simply giving this option. And the technology's there. It's not a pipe dream like so much of this bill, hoping that it shows up. It's actually there, it's clean, and if we can get the recycling of nuclear waste prohibition off the books, we could actually recycle it. Up to, again, do your research, up to 97%, and have low-cost, base-load effective electricity. Please vote green. Thank you, Mr.
Members,
President.
on the A3 amendment, please keep your comments to the A3 amendments. Senator Rarick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to address this issue with the members and with you, Mr. President, in regards to these small modular nuclear reactors. I would highly encourage any member who wants to look at it to take the trip out to Idaho Falls. They welcome anyone from the public, let alone legislators from different states, to come out and learn about the technologies and how it is evolving and what they're looking at. What we learned out there this last summer was amazing. And again, this amendment is not requiring that any of this is brought to Minnesota, but it allows Minnesota utilities to join in these conversations and join in looking at how are these technologies going to evolve and give us that option for carbon-free power. One of the things I found most amazing about their presentation in regards to these small modular reactors was the fact that they're stackable. And so you maybe need a certain amount of power in this location and you would bring one, but maybe you suddenly realize you need more. You can bring in another one and add it to that and get what you need. And what struck me with that was, as we are retiring these fossil fuel facilities, they have all of the transmission lines right there, which goes back to the amendment that just failed before, asking for the facilities to remain. I would hope we would maintain those facilities so that these small modular nuclear reactors, if we get to that point, would be able to go to those locations because the transmission is there. It would greatly help reduce the cost of our future energy needs. That is the base load power that we absolutely know that we need. The other thing about these small modular reactors that was fascinating was in their testing, they're realizing they can transition from one source, or not source, but from one production form to another. So when our wind and solar are not producing, we could bring them online to turn a turbine, create electricity. But when wind and solar come online, we could transition them over and maybe produce hydrogen. Another emerging technology that we are looking at that is a future that we don't even completely understand today. But these small modular nuclear reactors can get us there and help us down that line as well. Maybe they could produce heat for a facility to operate that needs heat. So the flexibility with these small modular nuclear reactors is not limited to just electricity generation, which we're addressing in this bill, but it has the potential for so much more. But right now in Minnesota, we can't even go down that road. And as Senator Gruenhagen alluded to, the potentials that are there, we have spent fuel from our current nuclear reactors in Monticello and in Prairie Island. These small modular nuclear reactors, we can take that spent fuel and repurpose it to be used in these small modular nuclear reactors. There are other steps that we have to take in order to get there, but that is the potential. And we can actually start reducing the amount of spent fuel that we have at those locations and produce more power. We hear that there is 90 to 95% of the power available yet in those spent rods, that if we repurpose them, these small modular nuclear reactors can bring that down to next to zero. And they'll take a small amount of that rod, when repurposed, about the size of the end of your small finger, and then it is wrapped in protective material, so it's about the size of a golf ball. That's what's in that small modular nuclear reactor, and it will last for 20 to 30 years, running continuously. That is the potential future that this amendment is looking at, saying, Minnesota, let's let that be part of our discussion as we move forward. Thank you, Mr. President.
To the A3 amendment, Senator Pratt.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Matthews, for bringing this very important amendment. At the beginning of this debate, the chief author stated we should not be giving preference to certain types of carbon-free energy sources over another. And he just argued a few minutes ago that we're not giving a preference, and the preference is for the people of Minnesota to be winners. Members, the demand for electricity is going up, not down. The governor is pushing for electric cars to be more prevalent in our state. For electric buses, we're already using electric mining equipment on the Iron Range. The demand for electricity is only going up. And when I was on the Iron Range one time, I was talking to the president of the local steelworkers union, who said every 1% increase in the cost of electricity means that I lose one of my guys. And that really brought it home to me, Mr. President, that electrical energy is one of the backbones of our Minnesota economy. And shouldn't we be looking at every available technology? And if the true goal of this bill is to have carbon-free energy, shouldn't we be looking at every possible source of carbon-free energy? And Senator Matthews has brought one of the most up-and-coming new technologies in the nation. Mr. President, you and I serve on the Jobs Committee. We have for several years, and you know, one of the things I'm always amazed about is the ingenuity that we see in our state and our country. The ingenuity to solve problems. And so Minnesotans are not going to be the winners by limiting a cutting-edge technology. Minnesotans are going to be winners by having affordable and reliable energy when they need it. And as Senator Rarick said, if we happen to have an increase or an oversupply of energy, it can be diverted to other sources. But, Mr. President, what we cannot afford to do, what Minnesotans cannot afford to have happen, is us to start buying electricity on the spot market, where it's extremely expensive. And I know that's a little bit in the weeds for a lot of people, but that's what happens, members. And as Senator Matthews mentioned earlier, our grid was near failure this summer. Think about how scary that was, because it wasn't going to go down on a nice 70-degree day when we could open up the windows and have the breeze. It was going to happen on a 100-degree day with no breeze, with senior citizens and people with chronic conditions having to suffer through the heat. Members, this is a really, 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 really good amendment. This is an intuitive amendment. I think all of us in this chamber can look and say, we support Minnesota ingenuity. We support moving to a carbon-free generation, and we should not limit the technology to what we know today, but we should be advancing the technology beyond what we don't know today. Had we been taking this approach, Mr. President, we would still have kerosene lamps. But we don't. We've moved forward, Mr. President. So members, let's stand behind American ingenuity. Members, let's stand behind a clean energy source that will enhance our base load capacity, ensure the safety, the reliability, and the affordability of energy for all Minnesotans, and let's truly make Minnesotans the winners in this bill. Thank you.
Members, if I could just give you a gentle reminder to stick to the amendment, because we're starting to go a little further than where we should be. But I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to speak. But if you'd be so kind, that would be helpful. Senator Howell.
Thank you, Mr. President. And members, you know, my military career started in the Navy. And although I wasn't what we called a nuke, I didn't go to school for nuclear. I was an electronics, avionics guy. But I remember looking at the Enterprise, the USS Enterprise, fabulous carrier, nuclear powered. First nuclear powered carrier that we had in the U.S. Navy fleet. She just got decommissioned. She just got actually cut up into razor blades, as we say in the Navy, but yeah, she went down to Texas where they're cutting her apart. But that carrier has served since the 60s. 60, 70 years without incident, without a problem. You look at the big ships in the Navy, they're all going nuclear. Safe, reliable energy. And when you think about that, just think about what we could do with small cell nuclear, have mutual supporting grids, small grids throughout our state, where if we have to take one down for maintenance, another one picks up. We could do that. They wouldn't be high targets like the big ones are. They wouldn't be a terrorist target because they don't have a lot of product in them. They don't have a lot of nuclear waste in them. They are safe. The Navy has proven that they're safe over the last 70 years. If we really want to be the cutting edge and the leaders in energy, we need to look at small cell nuclear, because I believe if you do your homework and you do your research, you will learn that say that 3 times fast. Small cell nuclear is where the future lies. And if you just discard it out of hand because it's nuclear, you are truly handcuffing us to unreliable energy that does not provide us the reliable, clean source of energy that can provide us in the future, and you're handicapping us in the future. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Lucero.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise because I'm very concerned about this Democrat bill that is going to provide guaranteed blackouts for Minnesotans. And this amendment to the amendment before us is seeking to address that reality. Mr. President, Minnesotans do not deserve to be thrust into a blackout period because of Democrat extreme bills that will threaten their lives, increase costs, and have a negative impact on reliability. Now, I think back to one of the words of wisdom that was given to me by a high school counselor. I must have been in 11th, maybe 10th, 11th grade. And I've never forgotten those words. And the words are, lack of planning on your part does not constitute an emergency on my part. And that's what this bill is doing. It is lack of planning that unfortunately is going to constitute an emergency on hardworking Minnesotans. The amendment before us, the amendment to the amendment, is speaking about modular nuclear reactors. On a side note, Mr. President, I was fully prepared to wear my radioactive green suit today in favor of this. But then I got the email that today is cardiovascular day or something to that effect. So that's why I'm wearing red in support of that, because I'm absolutely in favor of healthy hearts, but I'm also in favor of nuclear power. And what I'm thinking of is an example that I think all of us, I know, each and every one of us has direct experience with, and that is cloud technology. So when it comes to internet, servers, websites, we've all heard cloud technology. Now, what is the attractiveness of cloud technology? It's scalable, and it allows for a very quick ramping up with an increased demand in resources. So cloud technology allows for the scaling of hard drive space, so disk space, the scaling of RAM, and the scaling of processor power. You can scale those up as needed. That's what this amendment to the amendment similarly does. It allows for the scaling up when demand is needed. And so this Democrat bill, again, that threatens the lives of Minnesotans because of its poor planning, thrusting Minnesotans into a future emergency of blackouts, is absolutely why we're going to need the ability to ramp up the generation of power at the spur of the moment with modular nuclear reactors. So, Mr. President and members, please vote in favor of this amendment to the amendment so we can avoid the destruction of reliability in our energy grid. We can avoid the radical, dramatic increase in costs to Minnesotans, and again, not thrusting them into the dark ages with blackouts. Thank you.
Senator Barr.
Thank you, Mr. President, members. This is, I think, a good opportunity to illustrate how the government can get in its own way. We've heard that we don't want to restrict everything's on the table. We want to, be carbon free, but voting against this amendment says that not everything is on the table. Not all options are on the table. So I wanted to give an example of how the government got in its own way a few years ago, about 10 or 12, 15. So I come out of the transportation industry. One of the major
truck manufacturers in the United States was working in 2006. They were working on technology similar to that used by the freight train, the diesel electric locomotive. And they were trying to implement that same technology into a truck, and they'd actually developed the prototype and built the prototype, and they were out in Phoenix, running from Phoenix to Flagstaff, up and down the mountain during the summertime. So 120 degrees in Phoenix, and you're pulling full loads up 6, 7, 8% grades up and down out of Phoenix to Flagstaff and back to see if you can break the prototype. And then that fall, they took it up to Alaska, and they froze it and run it all winter up and down mountains in Alaska. And then they have most of the bugs worked out of this, and then they take it to the Federal Transportation Highway Administration and say, hey, we want to build this new technology. And the government said, sorry, your braking systems don't work. They work, but they don't fit our rules. You cannot build this because our government rules say that this doesn't fit into you're putting the square peg in the round hole type of thing, ergo you can't do this. So what would have been the advantage? At that particular time, the average fuel mileage in a commercial truck was just a hair under 6 miles to the gallon. 5.9 point something was average fuel mileage. That prototype truck was over 17 miles to the gallon. So we could have reduced diesel consumption by all of the trucks that we all see every day going up and down the highway by 2.5, but it would have increased fuel mileage by 2.5%. So you're talking about, what, 30% of consumption of your current consumption, all because the rules at the federal level got in the way, and they refused to change the rules. This is another example of a new and upcoming cutting technology that could be used to reduce carbon emissions and get us closer to the goal of carbon-free, while still preserving the grid integrity, base load, on demand, and yet we're going to put rules in place that does not allow that. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Westrom.
Mr. President, members, I urge your support of this innovative technology for clean, affordable, reliable energy as part of the energy solution for our consumers in Minnesota. If we're going to embrace all types of clean energy, we need to embrace this amendment as well. Members, last summer I had constituents reach out to me, and they are part of a group that's promoting sustainable energy sources. And in the agriculture arena, in our Ag Committee, we have a lot of sustainable options that we look at for agriculture, and I thought, well, this will be an interesting discussion. I wonder where they're going to go with all of their discussion. I thought, oh, they're going to maybe want to have more biomass growing, and we can haul it into a place to incinerate it to make energy, and other types of biomass plants. That's been worked on in the last 10 and 20 years. I thought, what other types of sustainable energy are they going to be talking about? Well, to my surprise, members and Mr. President, one of the things they were pushing as an energy or an environmental group for energy, sustainable energy, was new nuclear as part of our electric grid, because we need baseload energy. They understood as consumers, they want sustainable energy sources that are clean, but they also know they need electricity that's reliable and affordable. And that's what they were talking to me about. So, members, we have the opportunity right now on this amendment to support innovative modular nuclear. Let's keep our consumers, let's keep the ratepayers in mind and support this amendment so we have affordable, reliable electricity in Minnesota. What are we afraid of? I know there's some ignorance out there, and I will just ask the question. I'll give you the answer, Mr. President, so we can keep things moving along. But in 2003, I became the chair of the Regulated Industries in the House of Representatives. We had to deal with a bill called Prairie Island 2. Well, that gave my committee and myself an opportunity to learn a whole lot more about the electrical grid system and the sources of base load electricity. And up to that point, I was a little naive, just like my children's teacher. A year or two ago, they came home from school. My kids were telling me how their teacher was telling them how bad this nuclear is and all that stuff is emitting that comes out of the plant, referring to the Monticello plant. Nuclear is so bad, it pollutes so bad. And I said to my kids, what did she tell you comes out of that smokestack? Well, it's just a lot of pollutants. So, Mr. President, I'd like to ask the author of the bill, but I'll spare us the time, if he knows all the things that are coming out of that smokestack on the nuclear plants. And what's coming out of those smokestacks is an element called H2O. H2O, folks. It's emitting steam, and yet there's a lot of people in the public that think it's emitting these pollutants into the air out of the nuclear plants. Now, this is 21st century nuclear, modular, much more efficient, but nuclear is a viable source. We do need electricity. We need reliability in our electric system. Consumption is going up. More and more people are benefiting their lives with electricity, but not if we're going to double and triple and raise the rates through the roof. We've seen what 10 and 20% increases in rates or costs of goods do in the last 2 years under the circumstances we find ourselves in right now. People can hardly afford their lives, their groceries. Gas prices nearly doubled in the last 2 years. It puts a huge strain on the consumer and the families in Minnesota. And if we're going to be worried about them, we can't be so willfully blind to ignore technologies like modular nuclear and other clean technologies that should be part of the equation. I urge you to vote yes on this amendment.
Senator Dietzig.
Thank you, Madam President. Members, we're going to recess and go back to committees and then come back after committees. So I move, Madam President, I move to lay House File 7 on the table and request a roll call vote.
The motion is not debatable. The Secretary will take the roll. Senator Konesh, if you have a report on those voting remotely.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Port votes aye.
Senator Port votes aye. Secretary will close the roll. There being 37 ayes and 30 nays, the motion to lay on the table prevails. Senator Dietzig.
Thank you, Madam President. I move to recess to the call of the President at about 5:15.
Senator Dietzig, did you wish to ask for a roll call?
Sure, Madam President. Roll call requested.
There's been a roll call requested on the motion to recess. The Secretary will take the roll. Senator Konesh, do you have those voting remotely?
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Port votes aye.
Senator Port votes aye. Secretary will close the roll. There being 35 ayes and 27 nays, the motion prevails. The Senate is in recess until the call of the President.
Good afternoon, everybody. Don't you love that silence there? It'd be nice, maybe we could get some bumper music would be to go online, and that would be even better. Welcome everybody to